For creators in any medium, the removal of content throughout development is just part of the standard process. As ideas percolate and wider concepts develop, some ideas that seemed perfect at the time just don't work anymore, and it leads to elements being cut to make sure the final product is much more aligned to what the original objective was. Such deleted scenes have become pretty iconic when looking at the various movies and TV shows that have existed over the years, but it's often easy to forget that video games have just as much cut content, if not more. The only challenge is that it's not easily accessible. Even though the marketing teams associated with said movies and TV shows have realised there's a huge amount of potential in sharing those alternative takes, publishers of video games prefer to be much more secretive, pretending that there was no plan outside of the one we ended up seeing. The only slight deviation from this comes with the release of concept art, where we get to see how characters might have looked. But it's rare that information is released about alternative storylines and features that had to be scrapped, outside of side comments and interviews, or fans combing through the source code in search of interesting morsels. Today, we're going to be running through a load of secret elements that we actually know were cut from numerous Final Fantasy games, and we're going to kick things off with an interesting minigame that was meant to appear in Final Fantasy IX. But there's something we need to talk about first, the future of the channel. Thanks to your support, we've been able to create something that we feel is pretty special. A place where long-term fans and those who are only just getting into the franchise can come to be nostalgic and learn more about the games they love. But we want things to keep getting better, and one of the most direct ways that that can be achieved is by supporting us on Patreon. We have just done a complete refresh that adds new perks like a monthly livestream and early access to upcoming videos. We've also committed to making a series about the complete history of Ivalice if we can get up to 250 Patreon supporters, and anyone who supports us before the end of January will be able to suggest any video for us to make. Now, even if you don't want to support us on Patreon or just can't, please do know that we remain eternally grateful to everyone, no matter how they choose to support the channel, and we hope that throughout 2022 we can continue to elevate the quality of our content, creating new and exciting ways for you all to enjoy the Final Fantasy franchise. Alright, on with the video. Much like Final Fantasy VII and VIII, Final Fantasy IX featured a significant number of minigames. Quite a few, such as the jumping rope and the race against Hippolyte, would end up proving to be quite challenging, especially if players wanted to try and acquire items and achievements associated with mastery. Both of those minigames could be found within Alexandria at various points of the game, but based on what we know from analysis of the game's source code, there was planned to be a third minigame based in Alexandria. We have no idea what the game was due to be called, but it existed in its entirety within the game's final source code, albeit dummied out. It could still be accessed via hacking though, and should the hack be successful, players would be able to play the minigame as part of their return to Alexandria on Disc 3. Initiated by talking to a girl, the objective was to gather as many balloons as possible and give them to the boy before the timer ran out. It sounds simple enough, but only one balloon could be picked up at a time, and with 4 types of balloon available, each offering different points upon delivery and granting different time bonuses on the clock, the collection of each balloon was planned to be quite strategic. There's no word on what rewards might have been offered for this minigame, but it would have been an interesting little distraction in the latter half of the game. Another interesting cut came with the first iteration of the Crystal Chronicles franchise. Throughout much of its development, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles was in a state of flux. The development team were working with brand new technology and had been given specific objectives by Nintendo around producing a Final Fantasy game that was unlike anything seen before in the franchise. As such, they explored the creation of a free-flowing action RPG that, by leveraging the strengths of the Game Boy Advance and the GameCube, would be able to create a multiplayer experience that wouldn't just be innovative in the context of the Final Fantasy franchise, but would be unlike anything ever seen within the general video gaming sphere. It was an admirable goal, but realizing that goal would prove to be a challenge. Feedback from initial playtests showed that everything was just far too complicated, and it led to numerous changes to graphical elements, gameplay systems, and the story. Perhaps the most interesting element that we know about revolved around the initial intentions for there to be a main party, something that was quite traditional within the realm of RPGs. When Crystal Chronicles was announced, Square revealed that focus would be placed on a party made up of 4 characters called Roy, Linley, Stia, and Voice. But a few months later, Akitoshi Kawazu clarified by stating that there would be no AI characters. It would be a solo experience with friends able to occupy other positions within the multiplayer setting. When Crystal Chronicles was then shown at E3 a few months later, The demo contained 4 characters, and they were now called Kieran, Luge, Kiad, and Hias. These names disappeared from the final product, with players able to give their own names to the characters, something that suggested they were only placeholders for the demo, but that wasn't quite the reality. As revealed in the Ultimania guidebook for Crystal Chronicles, the names used in the E3 demo represented predefined names associated with each race, with one name associated with the male character and one for the female character. Even though they weren't used within the final product, some of the names were incorporated into supporting material, such as the manga called Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles Beyond the Endless Sky. Variants of the names were also used in Crystal Chronicles Echoes of Time, and as Crystal Chronicles started to appear in crossover experiences such as Theatrhythm, the trading card game, and Opera Omnia, Kieran has often acted as the main representative. Now, even though it doesn't happen so much anymore, as Square did not allocate much in the way of resources towards localization, but still expected the process to be quick and efficient, ancillary content would often be cut to reduce the time taken. This affected numerous games released on the Famicom and Super Famicom, and even though Square realized the need to improve this aspect of their business, games released on PlayStation often suffered the same fate. There are numerous examples of this, with Final Fantasy Tactics often singled out due to how poor the localization was. But one of the more frustrating elements was that due to time constraints and financial pressures relating to localization, the decision was taken to flat out cut content. One of the most prominent cuts was the Zodiac Brave story that could be found within the sound novels. They had no specific relation to the main plot, which is perhaps why they were cut during the localization process. But in the Japanese version, the sound novels helped to provide the player with an interactive way of learning more about the wider lore of Ivalice. Inavia Chronicles, for example, was a historical drama about the 3 daughters of Lord Albert of Kus Castle, with the player guiding a relationship that formed between Albert's youngest daughter, named Lucia, and a lowly gardener's son, something that would have been frowned upon due to the inherent class system prevalent throughout Ivalice. Over the years, fans have taken it upon themselves to try and translate the sound novels based on the PlayStation release, but despite Final Fantasy Tactics War of the Lions receiving a much better English script thanks to the efforts of Alexander O. Smith and Joseph Reeder, and the same time and budgetary restraints no longer being an issue, the sound novels still remained a Japanese exclusive part of the game, and remained so when War of the Lions was later ported to mobile devices. Still, if you'd like to learn more about Ivalician lore, we'd recommend checking out translations of the first 3 sound novels that were done by Mark Rosa, aka Tully the Bubba, assuming you can actually get the website to work. Unlike Final Fantasy Tactics, where content was cut due to a lack of time and budgetary constraints, Final Fantasy XIII had the opposite problem: too much time and too many resources. This led to there being no real shared vision amongst the development team, and as Motomo Toriyama shared in a post-mortem in Game Developer magazine, even at a late stage of development, we did not agree on key elements of the game, which stemmed from a lack of cohesive vision, the lack of finalized specs, and the remaining problems with communication between departments. It was far from an ideal situation, and because there was so much discourse amongst the development team, significant changes were made to the game throughout its development. These changes related to the story, the gameplay mechanics, and of course, the content that would be available to the player, and it led to the removal of a significant piece of content called the 7th Arc that was originally planned to be a free battle area with numerous quests available. Even though the entire location is present within the game's source code, it's unfinished, and as such, was rendered inaccessible to the player upon the game's launch. Yoshino Kitase revealed that they had planned to make it available to the player as downloadable content post-launch, but they decided against it because they felt it wasn't quite up to the quality they wanted, and because of the great differences between the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 network systems. With much of the content actually present in the final source code though, the 7th Arc would have probably been handled in a similar manner to Resident Evil 5's Versus expansion, which was only 2 megabytes, leading to suggestions that it was already on the disc, something that they did end up denying years later. Either way, when Final Fantasy XIII launched on the PC, fans found the 7th Arc when digging through the source code, and within the explorable dungeon, the developers had placed a nemesis boss that was similar to the fal'Cie players encountered near the beginning of the game. Due to its exclusion from Final Fantasy XIII, this was then repurposed for a battle in Final Fantasy XIII-2 against the demi-fal'Cie known as Adam. Now, by the mid-2000s, even though many of the 8-bit and 16-bit Final Fantasy games had received ports and even remakes, Final Fantasy III had always stood out as the exception. Decent progress was made on a remake for the WonderSwan Color, but after the development team encountered technical difficulties, the project ended up being cancelled. To ensure their efforts weren't wasted, the leadership team at Square decided to explore other options, with the Game Boy Advance being considered a logical solution. But even though numerous advanced games of Final Fantasy were produced, Final Fantasy III was again missing, as the decision had instead been made to go big or go home. Instead of producing Final Fantasy III Advance, they would produce a brand new version of Final Fantasy III for the Nintendo DS. It would feature 3D graphics and a host of other changes, such as named protagonists, and to try and make the game feel more modern, they were even planning to introduce a 5th party member slot. This was revealed by Hiromichi Tanaka and Tomoyo Asano when they spoke to Dengeki magazine ahead of the game's launch. It was revealed the 5th party slot would be used by guest characters such as Desh and Princess Sarah, with them acting as a full extension of the party. Such a decision would have had a significant impact on the balancing of those sections in comparison to the original game, and in the end, due to the guest appearances being so sporadic, and perhaps to remove those balancing headaches, the development team decided it would be much more prudent to implement another solution. Instead of being a permanent member throughout their guest residency, the solution would instead see the guest characters provide aid randomly at the start of battles, just like in the original game. Final Fantasy XIV serves as one of the most successful redemption arcs in the history of video gaming, and because of how successful it has become, it's often easy to forget that there was a story in the original version of the game, and it wasn't all that bad. It would start out with nation-state storylines, much like A Realm Reborn, and they would merge into the Path of the 12, which would introduce the Primals and the wider threat to the world. As part of this, Titan and Leviathan were planned to be introduced as major encounters alongside the likes of Ifrit and Garuda, but neither were ever introduced as part of the story, with their involvement cut for compassionate reasons. On the 11th of March 2011, Japan was devastated by an earthquake and tsunami, and the development team felt it would be irresponsible and insensitive for them to release content based around primals that had a strong affinity to the creation of earthquakes and tsunamis. From what has been disclosed about the cut content, the plan was for the narrative to show a lot more depth regarding Titan, offering a glimpse at the primal's compassionate side and the relationship that existed with the kobolds. One cutscene that has been unearthed even had sound effects and voice acting, suggesting that it was a last-minute decision to shelve the content. But even though Square Enix ultimately wrote both primals out of the story, they still chose to repurpose aspects of the original vision into their appearances for A Realm Reborn. And that brings us on to our last inclusion, an interesting cut that happened during the development of Final Fantasy VIII, relating to Laguna. During earlier stages of the game's development, there were plans to have the story have quite an even split between Squall and Laguna, and this would have built on the concept that Katase had developed shortly after working on Final Fantasy VI, where the father and son would walk the same path, with NPC interactions with the son influenced by actions taken by the father in years past. As shown by an earlier version of the map, which was revealed in the Final Fantasy 25th Memorial Ultimania, there were meant to be many more Laguna-era events taking place, with more focus placed on conflicts between the likes of Esther and Trabia, as well as Laguna's escape from the Galbadian Republic. In fact, the game's scenario writer, Kazushige Nojima, revealed in an interview with Famitsu that they had even finished up an entire map for Laguna's world, along with plans for a much more fleshed out story. But despite there being so much effort placed on Laguna, the decision was taken by senior figures on the project to make his role smaller and smaller as development progressed, with the relationship to Squall left ambiguous as a result. And for this, Nojima still feels bad, as he felt Laguna deserved more time in the game. In fact, when asked about the kind of story a game focused around Laguna might contain, Nojima said he would like it to show more of his bad points, so that there would be more balance between his cool side and the side that's more there for comic relief. And with that, I think we're done. They were 7 interesting elements that ended up being cut from Final Fantasy games ahead of their release. Be sure to let us know in the comments which you found to be the most interesting, and of course, if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Alright guys, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, Anthony Hoffman and Gregory, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.